really honored to be able to introduce Cass Sunstein to you. Really glad that you're here with us today and look forward to your remarks. Cass Sunstein is the Robert Walmsley University professor at Harvard Law School, and he's the founder and director of the program on behavioral economics and public policy at Harvard as well. In 2018, he received the Holberg Prize from the government of Norway, which is sometimes likened to the Nobel Prize for people working in law and the humanities. He is the author of hundreds of articles and dozens of books. I introduce a lot of people, but dozens of books is not usually a part of the intro. And I'm sure a number of you have read a number of them. Nudge, obviously, being one that so many people have read and know. But there are many others, How Change Happens, On Freedom, Too Much Information. There's a long list of books. And in 2 weeks' time, he has forthcoming How to Become Famous, Lost Einsteins, Forgotten Superstars, and How the Beatles Came to Be, which we're really looking forward to. And if we want to reserve some time in Q&A for questions about the new book, that would be great. But please join me in welcoming Cass Sunstein to UT.
Okay, so it's a thrill to be here, seeing admired colleagues whom I've never met, seeing great friends who I don't get to see enough, and seeing people whose work and writing has been an inspiration. And also it's particularly thrilling to get to talk about this subject of dynamism, and I'm going to be going at it from a very specific angle. See that sludge? It's really, really disgusting. So we're getting off to an exciting start. It's gooey and you can't walk through it, but it kind of gets under your feet. And good luck with the quality of permission if your feet are stuck in sludge. Is there an International Sludge Academy at the OECD? Indeed there is, and the International Sludge Academy, which is new, has done sludge audits in over a dozen nations, discovering that this kind of goo is all over Europe and also the developing world, and I believe what I've just said is completely unintelligible. We're going to try to make it a little more specific. Sludge consists of obstacles, things that are put in one's way when one is trying, let's say, to begin a new company, to innovate in a certain way, to start with some entrepreneurial activity which might change the lives of thousands or tens of thousands. There is sludge, which is a challenge. If people are asked to find a license before they can, for example, be a landscape architect, they are encountering sludge. The sludge encountered by the hopeful landscape architect might take 6 weeks, it might take 6 months, it might take a year, it might involve forms that are unintelligible, it might impair economic growth, it might be an obstacle to a sense of individual dignity. There are permit requirements all over the world. Sometimes they are freedom reducing and welfare crushing. The idea of dynamism has an enemy in a permitting requirement, which makes it very hard for someone to do something that will make their life much better than what it now is. Here's another pictorial representation of sludge. See how green it is, not in a good way, but its greenness is actually intended as a pun, both on awful green and on let's say green with a halo around it. There is green with a halo around it sludge, which has the angels singing in the background, but which has human welfare languishing in the foreground. Here is the result of a sludge audit by the United States government in recent years. The question is, how many hours in paperwork burdens does the United States impose on people? The answer, I think, is now in the vicinity of 10 billion hours. Recently, it's been in the vicinity of 11 billion hours. 10 or 11 billion hours justifies the, let's say, self-censoring word, four-letter word, WHOA, where there might be other not self-censoring four-letter words that would be appropriate. And the reason there is a four-letter word associated with that is think for yourself about the human meaning of that 11 billion hours. It's imposed on students and administrators and on people who work in hospitals who might be nurses and doctors. It's imposed on patients. It's imposed on truck drivers. It's faced by people all over the United States who are trying to have a day, let's say, and their day is instead occupied by forms that are confusing and often too daunting to be navigated. Shall I say parenthetically, by way of footnote, that I'm about to give up on submitting an academic article to a journal which I've been invited to contribute to, and I'm very honored to contribute to, but the website is so sludge pervaded, I can't do it. And I'm about to refuse to submit the article because I'm incapable of doing it. There's good news, which is Executive Order 14058, a charming name, isn't it? You'll never forget that name, Executive Order 14058. You've probably not heard of it because it's issued by the current president, and the Republicans like it and have no incentive to cheer. The Democrats have other things in view, so they have no incentive to cheer. It calls out time taxes imposed on people and suggests that time taxes are being imposed in a promiscuous way on people who are trying to do business, people who are trying to innovate, people who are trying to get services from the US government. And there's an extraordinary list of initiatives and reforms. It's based on the idea that the best way to obtain trust is to earn it. And if you do something that makes customer service better, whether you're a startup or the Department of Transportation, then trust will increase. It's a byproduct of performance. Okay, we need a little behavioral science, and let's just emphasize that there's a feature of the human brain shared with cats and dogs and horses and mosquitoes that involves cognitive scarcity. That economic scarcity is complemented by cognitive scarcity. That the number of things to which we can attend is a subset of the number of things that are relevant, and that means we have to set priorities, and often this is done extremely rapidly. If you're busy because you're, let's say, an entrepreneur trying to get started, or an innovator who's focusing on what you're going to innovate about, or if you're lonely because you don't have friends, or if you're hungry because you don't have food, or if you're really not feeling very well, or if you're poor, the problem of cognitive scarcity jumps to the sky. That is, if you are hungry and flashed on the screen are the following letters, C, D, A, E, Q, R, K, LMA, then you will automatically see, and no one in this room is seeing, visualizing these letters, the word cake. Because if you're hungry, C-A-K-E, shout out from that random assortment of letters. This is based on data, by the way, not speculation. None of you saw, oh, he's spelling cake among those 14 or so letters. That's because you all just had lunch. If you are hungry, then you are focused on food, you see cake, and the number of other things that you're going to be able to focus on is small. Take this as a poignant reason, not the only one, why sludge can be a barrier to growth. If you are poor and asked to solve an economic problem that you personally face before you take an intelligence test, your intelligence falls by 8 or 9 points on the IQ scale. That's about the same amount that your intelligence falls on an IQ scale if you've had no sleep the night before. If you aren't poor and you're asked to solve an economic problem of some magnitude before you take an intelligence test, your intelligence falls 0. It's not a thing. If you are poor and asked to solve an economic challenge that you personally face, and then have a test of your capacity for self-control, your executive function collapses. It's because executive function requires cognitive plenitude, not cognitive scarcity. That's to say that people who are faced with a problem of economic distress, asked to solve an economic problem, face diminution in their fluid intelligence and in their self-control. Good luck with that. Take that as a problem faced by people in economic distress, but as parallels in people who have other kinds of challenges, including people who have cognitive scarcity just because they've got a lot to do. A really bad combination is scarcity and sludge. And often sludge is imposed in our economic system on people who are suffering from scarcity of time, they're really, really busy, or scarcity of resources, they don't have much money. And this is an act of cruelty, not intended by those who impose sludge, typically, though sometimes it is, an act of cruelty with very severe consequences. It has severe consequences for growth. This is compatible with the first presentation, the keynote you heard today, where sludge can be a terrible obstacle to development, both in wealthy countries and in poor countries. Certainly it's so in the United States, which is why we need a movement for sludge reduction, starting, let's say, today, that's born of social science research, work in business schools, and work by people who are just concerned with opportunity for all, not equal opportunity, but yes, opportunity for all. Sludge has adverse effects on job creation because it stymies efforts to do things that would make more and better employment for people. Think of that 11 billion hours as a window onto the not wonderful world of sludge. My co-author and beloved friend, Daniel Kahneman, died recently, you may know. And I want to make a little note on his final paper, which is A Triumph of the Human Spirit, written when he was approximately 90 years old. And his final paper grew out of a paper he did with Angus Deaton approximately 14 years ago, which said that well-being increases with money up to about $70,000 or $90,000 a year, at which point it levels off. That's a very provocative paper. It suggests that if you are poor, your measured well-being in terms of experience of life starts to jump. After $70,000 or $90,000, it flattens. Bracket for the moment, if you would, the reliability of the measures of well-being, and just notice this was the finding of Deaton and Kahneman, a pretty potent combination. A graduate student named Killingsworth did a paper a few years ago based on more refined data than the Deaton-Kahneman data, showing that they were wrong. More money really is better in terms of well-being, and there's no ceiling. Kahneman's reaction to this fundamental attack on his paper at the age of 89, I think, was to call up the graduate student, Killingsworth, who published the paper, and says, let's write a paper together and see who's right. Let's have a specified hypothesis. This is an adversarial collaboration in which we will agree on what the data would have to look like for one or the other of us to be proved right, and let's interrogate the data with our competing hypotheses in mind. Killingsworth, probably astounded to get this call from the great Kahneman, was agreeable, and the ultimate paper, which emerged just a few months ago, showed that Killingsworth was more right than Kahneman. The basic finding is that with economic increase, measured well-being keeps going up and up and up. Point for Killingsworth, with one qualification: people at the bottom 15% of the happiness distribution flatten. At the bottom 15% of the happiness distribution, people who are really struggling with well-being, things get better and better and better between $10,000 a year and $100,000 a year. But then it flattens. In fact, the acceleration for unhappy people at the lower ends is really fast and really big. After 100,000, they flatten. Why is that? Kahneman and Killingsworth don't know, so they don't say anything. They speculate cautiously that if you're suffering from depression or anxiety, you really need to earn more than $20,000, and more is better. But after $100,000, you're still going to be kind of struggling. In any case, take this to be a tribute, it's state of the art, to the relationship between dynamism, related to economic growth, and measures of well-being that are not monetary. Okay, many of you I know got here by airplane. I hope you use TSA pre. On average, for many people, 5 to 7 minutes to get through. That's a sludge reduction strategy for travelers, and the monetized benefit of TSA pre, welfare benefit for persons, is, let's just say, really high. I hope many of you have global entry, which means that people get to come into the United States who are Americans in a hurry. That is a sludge reduction strategy by the US government, compatible with national security goals. And what America should have now, if it wants to promote innovation, is global entry for everything, the functional equivalent of that. That's a world with much less sludge. In the educational domain, connected with dynamism, here's a staggering paper from 2018. The fact is that the University of Michigan, one of our great public universities, give or take a Texas or Berkeley, has a problem. Remember when Tom Hanks, before he was an actor, was an astronaut? Do you remember that? He was on Apollo 13, and he said, Houston, he famously said, Houston, we have a problem? Or was that a movie? In any case, Houston, we have a problem in Michigan, which is the people who go are high-income, smart students. That's not the worst problem in the world. But what about low-income smart students? Where do they go? Not the University of Michigan. That's a little baffling because they get free tuition and fees on admission if they apply, but they don't apply. The intervention was basically just to take the sludge away. All that happened was the interveners, let's call them, told the students and the parents and the principals, please apply. You're going to get free admission, free tuition. You're going to be able to hear a song that's kind of pleasing, like the song you just heard. Thank you for that intervention. They got that song. Actually, they got a Taylor Swift song, not that particular one. The Taylor Swift song they got was a love story, which encourages admission for young people looking for same. And they got information about free, no fees. So get the intervention. All it said was, here you go. You don't have to do anything. You're in. The result was to double the likelihood of application and to more than double the enrollment at the University of Michigan. The effects persisted through 2 years. The intervention, and this is the staggering finding, closed by half the income gap in college choice among Michigan's high-achieving students. No money, just information about something where information acquisition would have entailed the incursion of sludge. By the way, here's an intervention to reduce gun deaths in the United States, a 3 to 5 day waiting period before you get a gun. That significantly decreases as many states have gun deaths. It just imposes a little sludge before people get guns. Okay, occupational licensing and permit requirements are sludge. Our healthcare system has a lot of sludge in it. David Cutler has found that a significant contributor to the cost of healthcare in the United States can be found right here. Education has sludge pervading it. I had lunch with some students at a very distinguished university about 18 months ago and asked them about the healthcare system at their university. There were about 6 of them at lunch. 4 of them said it was great. One of them said, for me, it's not so great. And I asked why. And she said, well, I suffer from depression. I said, why is that a problem with the healthcare system? She said, well, to get healthcare help for my depression, I had to navigate so many processes and talk to so many people and fill out so many forms that I started to get really, really depressed. And she had humor and mischief in her voice as well as exasperation. She said, I gave up. And then the 6th person in the student group of 6 said, you have depression, I have anxiety. I'm not going to go into detail about my story about why I gave up. Okay, for building things, a particular interest to Professor Glaser, sludge is public enemy number 1, and we need to build a lot of things in the United States. Okay, take now not the problem of growth, but the problem of desperation. You may or may not love the special supplemental nutrition program for women, infants, and children. I love that program. In a recent year, more than 2.4 million infants in the US were eligible. 80% didn't participate in the program, and 50% of eligible pregnant women didn't participate. And the reason is sludge. To get in the program requires navigating processes and keep in mind the problem of scarcity, which is faced particularly in the relevant population. Okay, courtesy of 1980, we have a law called the Paperwork Reduction Act. Has it fulfilled its promise? No. That was a rhetorical question. Was it yours truly's job to oversee the Paperwork Reduction Act for 4 years? Yes. Is this presentation a mea culpa? The answer to that is not no. Let's keep in mind the fact that that 11 billion hour figure has been pretty steady over time. The result of a national sludge audit is to uncover at the macro level what you're seeing right now. The Department of Education imposes 90 million annual hours of paperwork burdens on people, including students and administrators and Professor Glaser department chairs. The Department of Agriculture imposes 127 million hours on farmers, many of whom don't have a lot of time to fill out forms. The Department of Labor imposes 144 million hours on workers, employers, and others who fall in a general category. The Department of Transportation is north of 200 million hours, and the Department of Treasury is the prize winner at 7 billion hours. These are numbers, but keep in mind that the level of human distress caused by these obstacles and barriers is really high. And because we've been with each other for part of a day, I'm just going to tell you a story, slightly personal story. I'm speaking here in my academic capacity. I'm also a bureaucrat at the Department of Homeland Security, and a personage, not just a person, in Washington, D.C., called me a few months ago saying my son needs green card something to happen because his grandmother is dying and he needs to be able to see her before she dies. And can you help? And I said, no. This is a personage in DC who's not an American, but who's well known and important and amazing. And my no answer, I felt very bad about on ethics grounds. And the person felt much worse than I did. Not guilty as I felt, but enraged, saying, you can't help? And the rage got to me, so I called my people at the department and said, here's the problem, is there anything we can do? And the answer I got is, what part of ethics do you not understand? Do you not understand that word? And I, of course, backed off and called my friend and said, I can't help. And my friend said in response to that unwelcome news, what do I do? I don't know how to handle the website. I spent hours on it. I can't find a person. My mother-in-law's dying. And I gave the only answer I could think of, call a lawyer. The person did call a lawyer and called me back the next day and said the lawyer solved it in 10 minutes. He knew exactly what to do. But this wasn't a triumphant call. It was instead an outrage call. The person said, what about all the other people who don't know that you have to call a lawyer? What about them? That was a really good question. And in this number-pervaded chart, there are countless stories exactly like that might involve a little company trying to get workers from a country where they're available, or might involve someone who needs a permit from somebody and has no idea how to get it. We need a Paperwork Reduction Act for Texas. We need one for Mississippi. We need one for California big time. We need one for my state, Massachusetts. And the Paperwork Reduction Act should have all of the good content of the Federal Paperwork Reduction Act, but more, and I'm going to get to that before very long. Okay, I know the question on everyone's lips is what's the relationship between sludge and nudge? The fact that they rhyme is maybe a coincidence, but we want to know how are they connected with one another. I'm not going to be terribly fussy about the definition of sludge. Let's just understand it as friction stemming from paperwork and associated burdens, time spent standing in line, in-person interview requirements, forms that are complicated, places you have to go, all these are sludge. Here's a little chart that might clarify. If there is radical simplification of processes or automatic enrollment in something from which people benefit, that counts as a low friction, make it easy nudge. If there is a harmful make it easy nudge, as in automatic enrollment in a program that entitles you to 10% off if you ever go to a war zone and want to stay in a hotel there, there is a program like that, by the way. It's fraud, meaning people don't want to go to those hotels, but they are convinced to enroll in those programs, and it's really easy. Consider that a nudge for evil. Then there are deliberation promoting nudges. Are you sure you want to? Or a cooling off period. You know those things? Those are sludge, which impose friction for good, but my focus is on the bottom right, permitting nightmares, long waiting times, form filling, Stephen King novels. I follow Stephen King on Twitter. He doesn't follow me, but I really want him to write a book about sludge and make it really very scary. Okay, I'm hopeful that many of you are thinking right now that sludge imposed by, let's say, Texas or Austin or Washington, D.C. might have a purpose for it, and it might not be simply an effort to create terribleness for people. And so let's discuss 5 defenses of sludge as attempting optimally to balance dynamism and other salutary goals. The most provocative defense of sludge is that ordeals can be a sorting mechanism. So let's suppose that Taylor Swift is playing right there the night after next. Am I getting your hopes up? I confess I'm a big fan. It could happen. It could be true. To my knowledge, it's not true. Suppose she's playing right there. How are we going to sort access? It could be that we'd impose an ordeal on people, meaning you have to get in line starting at approximately 3:30 today. And if you're toward the front of the line, you're going to get access to the Taylor Swift concert. Now, if that is sensible, it's because time, like money, can measure intensity of need or desire, and it ends up sorting reasonably who deserves access to the thing. Data so far is suggesting that this rationale from the amazing Professor Zeckhauser and others is in principle potentially true, but in practice it doesn't work. It's a very bad sorting mechanism typically. Okay, the most boring justification for sludge is privacy and consent, that you require people to provide information because you don't want the government to be getting access to that information without people's knowledge or approval. That's fair. That's completely fair. Does it justify the existing level of sludge? That would be a miracle. The most pragmatic justification is that if you're giving out money, let's say, for people to do something, maybe it involves technology, maybe this shouldn't be done at all, but let's suppose it's being done, you want to acquire data about performance. How are things going with your enterprise? The most important justification is program integrity. That is, we want to make sure that people are getting permits who deserve permits. Maybe permit requirements should be excised entirely, but so long as they're in place, we want to make sure the sorting is the right sorting. And we might want to promote deliberation, as with Are You Sure You Want To sludge, which is designed to ensure that people aren't reckless or impulsive. Okay, environmental protection and worker safety are familiar reasons for sludge, but I'm going to tell you, with your indulgence, a personal story about 19-year-old me and the National Environmental Policy Act. When I was about 19, a college student, I worked for the Army Corps of Engineers writing environmental impact statements, and I saw very close up. Back then, I'm now, you can probably tell, in my late 20s, so this is a long time ago. 19-year-old me, even way back then, saw that environmental impact statements with the honorable goal of promoting consideration of significant environmental effects before permits are given were often sludge imposers on the private and public sector, which were designed to stop development in ways that were often not environmentally magnificent, but were instead designed to promote the interests of self-interested private groups. And this is an old story. It's an old George Stigler story. It suggests that the National Environmental Policy Act, which should not be eliminated, should be rethought with the goal of ensuring the optimal level of sludge. Okay, let's talk a little bit about how to do that. For Texas, for New York big time, I've worked in New York on this, for Oklahoma and Georgia and New Jersey, there is a stock of existing sludge that needs to be managed with determination and laughter. And there is a flow of new sludge that has to be restrained with a degree of ferocity. How do we manage the flow of new sludge? Well, the first way to do that is to have a cost-benefit test, which ideally would be quantitative, and if you can't do that, it's more qualitative. So there's X amount of sludge being imposed on people who are trying to do X. What if we cut that in half? What will we lose? And these are fully answerable questions. We've talked about global entry and we've talked about TSA pre. They both emerged from cost-benefit tests, which suggested in both cases they're close to no regrets policies, all benefits, no costs. Not quite there. You need something to manage those programs, but it's not a big deal in terms of cost. to do cost-benefit balancing with respect to the flow of new sludge is good for America. With respect to the stock of existing flow, there's a lot that can be done. There could be a vague standard saying that there have to be significant reductions from every part of, let's say, state government by September 21st, 2024. I single that out because that's my birthday. Maybe it'd be better to say December 25th, the Christmas present to the people of a relevant state. There have to be significant reductions. Or it could be specific, saying we have to eliminate at least 3 million hours in paperwork burdens by a date certain. Specificity could be not in terms of hours, and I want you to be excited about this rather than seeing this as just adjectives and nouns, saying something like forms shall be pre-populated, so people don't have to fill them out. Forms will be annual rather than quarterly from now on. There will be electronic rather than paper filing. We will do pre-tests on existing forms to see if our anticipated burden is exceeded by the actual burden in the real world. Or we will eliminate a certain number of forms. Here's something that USCIS did, Citizenship and Natural Immigration Services. It issued a Federal Register notice asking for people to identify barriers and burdens, emphatically including businesses and entrepreneurs. What are the burdens and barriers you face in dealing with us? 7,000 comments were received, not 70, not 750, and the government marched through all of them, thinking which of these can be acted on. And a lot of them were, such that the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services issued a rule in 2022 increasing the automatic extension period for employment authorization from 180 days to 540 days. And there was dancing in the streets on the part of American employers, saying our workers can keep working. They don't have to go file. And while the workers themselves weren't dancing, they breathed a big sigh of relief. Here's a suggestion for permitting requirements of various sorts. Why not consider doubling or tripling the length of time that people can use to enjoy their existing permit? If it's for 4 years, try 8. That might not be a good idea in particular cases. If 8 is bad, maybe 6. And that automatically takes backlogs away, and it leads to at least relevant increases in dynamism. The Department of Homeland Security issued a 20 million hour challenge saying we have to eliminate 20 million hours in paperwork burdens imposed on people in short order. You saw from the earlier slide, 200 million hour total, remember that? Department of Homeland Security? Maybe not. That's approximately the number. This was a 10% decrease, basically in a heartbeat. That's in a very aggressive goal, and the department beat that. 21 million hours were eliminated. Some people I've found in DC who are kind of friends who deal with the government have said getting approval for something within a week rather than a year. What is happening at DHS? It's sludge reduction. The executive order, whose name even I forgot, was it 14707? Maybe? Not a good mnemonic. The time taxes executive order has, it's very unusual from an executive order from the president. They're often a page or 2 or 3, and they're at high level. This is really long, and it says such things as eliminate permit requirements, make things automatic, simplify for farmers. If people are eligible for this, and you know that, because they've applied, and they're also eligible for that and that and that, don't make them apply. They're in automatically. I'm not going to bore you with the full examples. I'm just going to choose 2. One exemplary is the Secretary of State has to design a new online passport renewal experience. You don't have to mail anything. Now, this isn't going to drive innovation big time in the United States, but it's going to take away frustration and terribleness imposed on people who have to show up in an unfamiliar place and deal with unfamiliar people when they're just hoping to get to London for the trip of a lifetime. Here's the best slide of all. This is Administrator Power, who happens to be my wife, and the executive order directs her to revise and review regulations, forms, instructions, etc., so that countries in USAID works can get the resources to which they have a legal right. It might be people in Ukraine who are dealing with, guess what? It might be people in Pakistan who are dealing with flooding. It might be people in a nation that's trying to stand on its own feet with development. And the idea is to take away the sludge. Shall I tell you a very inside baseball story? If you no reporters are here, I'll tell you a little Washington story. None of you is, what's the word for journalist? Is that the word? We don't have any journalists here. I'll tell you a little story. It's not terribly sensitive. That as this executive order was written, as any executive order is, there were a lot of interagency processes to make sure it's okay. And the USAID one, I had some engagement with, and having such engagement, I would ask my spouse, is this okay? Yes? Both as a good government person and as a good spouse. You don't inflict on the head of an agency to whom you're married an order from the president which she hates. That wouldn't be a good thing to do for the marriage or for the country. And she said, this is good. We like this. This is consistent with our goal. And then in the interagency process, there was some question about whether USAID was okay with this. And I was pleased to be able to say, they're good with this. They're enthusiastic about this. And in response, she's issued a 3 million hour challenge to eliminate 3 million hours of burdens on her agency staff with the goal of promoting dynamism in the nations with which the United States works. Okay, a question really for all of us is, what's the most precious thing that human beings have? Kind of terrible Hallmark card question. There are a lot of candidate answers. As the COVID pandemic goes in the rearview mirror, is that where it's headed? There's one answer, I think, that stands out above all others, and it's a 4-letter word. It's time. Let's find, shall we, in the interest of equality of permission, in the interest of liberty, in the interest of growth, a little doff of the hat to Kahneman in the interest of welfare. Let's find ways to give other members of the human race more of that. Thanks. So we might have, what's the word? We might have blank for questions.
Love the talk. Thanks so much, Professor Sunstein. So you painted an optimistic picture about government trying to actually save us all some time and give us some time back. And we all have in our minds a little bit more time on the beach, more efficiency in government provision of services, efficiencies created as a result. One thing in my neck of the woods, which is competition policy and antitrust, that springs to mind is the changes that have been put into place by the Biden administration for Hart-Scott-Rodino. So lawyer friends of mine estimate that under the old regulations, it would have taken them approximately 10 days to comply with the documentation requirements for just simply submitting paperwork associated with a potential combination of some sort. And the current estimate is now 180 days. I just wondered if you wanted to comment at all on the scope, not just for optimism, but also for pessimism. And I think this gets back to your stock versus flow. The flow ain't always good.
That's not an area I work in, and if it were, I'd be on that one very discreet as a bureaucrat myself. I'd say on optimism and pessimism, my hero is Amos Tversky, who said, I'm an optimist and it's rational to be an optimist because if you're a pessimist, you suffer twice. Right? Once when the bad thing happens and before when you're thinking about it. So of course there are parts of the US government that are not diminishing the stock or the flow, and there may be parts that are unreasonably not doing that. This is a work in progress. The incentive of the bureaucrat, political or not, to diminish sludge depends on things. So if your bosses are very focused on compliance, 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 then the flow might jump. If your boss is focused on flexibility and dynamism, then you might see a top-down directive to cut, 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 cut. It might be that some of the reduction in the stock and flow can come from non-political civil servants who've just heard from the private sector that this isn't doing any good. I'll tell you the thing I learned I've had 3 stints in the government. The second stint, the thing I learned most was that the process of notice and comment rulemaking, where you give notice to the public, I had thought as a longtime administrative law professor, as all the cool kids did, that was kabuki theater, that the real decisions were made behind closed doors, mostly by public officials themselves, sometimes with influential members of the public, and that notice and comment stuff is just a charade. It's not true. I learned what the cool kids thought was false, that if people say the paperwork burden imposed by this regulation is a horror, the likelihood that the paperwork burden will be reduced is real. It's not 100%, but it's real. So engagement with substantive stuff is a source of hope. The fact that we have an executive order that's basically all about time taxes that's like a shot across the bow of the federal bureaucracy. And if there are parts of the federal government that aren't doing it, it might be that they're independent agencies and not technically governed by it. It might be that they have policy priorities that go in the other direction. You know, I mean, if you think of the area of immigration, it's complicated. Yes, a lot of sludge on illegal immigrants, let's say, that's kind of welcome. We don't want it to be easy for people to do something that's illegal. That's program integrity big time.
Well, you know, of course, I commend you, and I want you to succeed in this. Is there any way of bringing a pricing of sludge into the calculation of these agencies?
Yeah, I completely love that. Thank you for that. And if people in this room include, yeah, the answer is yes. And I'll aside from just suggesting enthusiasm about the question, I'm going to give a little detail, but it's preliminary. So the federal agencies value an hour at approximately $27, last I checked. So if you impose 100 million hours in paperwork burdens, I was a literature major, not a math major, but I think I could figure that out. And we know that some of the paperwork burdens imposed by some agencies, it's kind of like the budget of the entire agency. We're talking about very big numbers in monetary terms. The federal government isn't doing this, but the benefit of TSA pre, the monetized benefit, is extremely high because the amount of time saved by the American people. Now that's, I hope you're thinking this, that the monetized time saving is just, you know, a little indicator. So if it's easy to get a permit, let's say, to do something, then you have a period in which you're doing the thing, which would generate social benefits also, which would otherwise be absent. And no one's doing this to my knowledge. John List, whom I admire greatly, the Chicago economist, has tried to monetize time using Uber data about how much people will pay to get the Uber to come earlier. And there's heterogeneity there. So for some people, let's suppose because they're got a lot of money and time to them is precious, they'll pay a lot. And for other people, it's not so bad, so there's heterogeneity. So the initial efforts are to use the $27 figure roughly, and then to try to cash out, so to speak, the savings. But this is not done. Here's something you've written and talked about, some of the challenges of cost-benefit analysis. I know, and that's true. There's a terrible epistemic problem government faces. But for regulations, there's at least a discipline that even if it isn't great or even good, it's good that it exists. So to have a cost-benefit test with a monetization of the cost of the time would impose a greater constraint than we now have. The Paperwork Reduction Act, this is astounding and horrible, doesn't have a cost-benefit test in it. It has a practical utility test. And maybe you can read it to say, don't impose pointless paperwork burdens, but the paperwork burden might be not pointless, but might not be worth it. And it's not clear that's in the statute, and the Paperwork Reduction Act isn't enforceable in court. It's all done within the executive. That takes away an ex-ante deterrent and an ex-post corrective. But there's a program here for a state, call it Virginia, to be a leader in monetizing paperwork burdens and taking them away. Here's a good predictor of whether people are going to be evicted from their homes. You ready? How close do they live to the courtroom? That's crazy. Why is it that how close you live to the courtroom is a good predictor? By good, I mean statistically significant. It's that if with the right test of statistical significance, that let's stipulate, that if you live far from the courtroom, you don't show up. And then you get evicted. If you live near to the courtroom, you show up, and the judge says, okay, landlord and tenant, you figure out a way. And having to go someplace is sludge. So in-person interview requirements, the press is not the enemy of the people, but in-person interview requirements are the enemy of the people. Not that, of course, I'm being ridiculous, but and sometimes they're necessary. But sometimes you can do it online, do a Zoom. Or don't make people who are maybe trying to start a company or to build something, don't make them go somewhere.
My question is about how the private sector is involved, if at all, in the creation of this sludge, or maybe are there places where the private sector introduces their own sludge that's not mandated by the government? So how do you see those connections within this space?
Okay, so Amazon has done well in part because it's a relatively sludge-free company on the purchasing side. So one click, you get it. Or, have you seen this? There's frustration-free packaging, where you buy a product and there you open it up and there's nothing there except the thing. And people like that. They don't market it as green packaging, by the way, though it is. They market it as frustration-free packaging. They probably have figured out that that's the right way to market it, but that's a comparative advantage. Apple products have a sludge reduction feature in the sense that they appeal to people's intuitions with respect to use. So that's just one of their selling points. You get the computer, this is part of Steve Jobs' genius, that he doesn't make psychological depletion occur with a product. On the other hand, some companies make it really easy to become, let's say, a subscriber and really hard to unsubscribe. Or if you want to return a product, you will have to navigate an obstacle course that's extremely difficult. Or there may be something that's happened to me, you buy a product and you got a little thing that you mail in, and you get a rebate. It's happened to be relatively recently. You get a rebate of $75. That sounds good. And I either lost the form or thought, I don't really have time to fill it out. And companies know that. They know that sludge. And so mailing in forms is often a way for companies to basically pocket a lot of money from people who think that they're going to mail in the form. So our Federal Trade Commission actually is very focused now on private sector sludge as a form of, not sure what the right word is, let's just say unlawful trade practice. And this can be complicated. Whether the Department of Transportation's recent rule saying you get automatic reimbursement in the face of cancellation of a flight, you don't have to navigate an obstacle course to get it, whether that's all things considered a good idea or not is something which probably requires sustained inquiry. But it has a logic to it, which is that for busy people to try to get reimbursement, it's like mailing in a form. A lot of people won't, or they won't know how. I'll say, make one little notation. I'd be inclined to say first that the government is what we should be most focused on, not the private sector, because there should be competition that will spur sludge reduction there. As a longtime University of Chicago person, that's my religion. But there's, I think, a quite good book by George Akerlof and Robert Schiller called Fishing for Fools, which shows that sometimes competition will cut the other way. You know, there's a profit opportunity with sludge.
I guess on that point, when it comes to government employees, I would imagine that there are a lot of jobs that could fairly be characterized as sludge management, where when you reduce sludge, you also reduce those jobs. So have you found resistance to some sludge reduction initiatives from sludge managers, and how do you package it to them?
Yeah. Okay, so in my round when I was in the White House, the level of enthusiasm for sludge reduction was really high. And the reason was a thought that economic growth is kind of a core part of the agenda of any president, and this is a relatively painless way to get it. I did find one agency when I was not in government with which I was working, which was cautious about sludge reduction at a political level because it was worried about program integrity. So I think if we reduce the sludge, that'll cause 17 good things to happen, but it'll also cause one bad thing to happen, which people will get a thing that they might not be legally entitled to get. And we don't want that. And you can take your pick about what the thing would be, and that's a resistance. Among the civil servants, I found an extremely interesting dynamic, which is that civil servants in the US government, I have a ton of admiration for. They work really hard and they're not paid a lot. And they know a ton, and they basically just want to do what the law requires or what their bosses tell them. And at one time, the sludge reduction effort was not greeted with enthusiasm on the ground that we're really busy. We also have to do this. What's it even going to look like? It wasn't about maintaining jobs. I didn't see that. It was about, there are only 14 hours in a working day. But what I saw, which was thrilling, and I won't mention the department, was that the excitement grew and grew over time. Where the first meetings, there was grumpiness, and then their own knowledge of where the sludge was bad would create it became a little like a startup, a government startup at sludge reduction. And then it became like a machine that ran on its own. And I'm thinking on Ed Glazer and I have worked on this, but I'm thinking for state and local government, where a lot of the sludge problem is most serious, this is a terrific opportunity. That there are many states that are stultified in one or another way, and sludge might be a lot of the picture or a little bit, but to take away a little bit of the stultification, that might change the lives of 800 people. That's pretty good.
Thank
You go. Thanks so much. Thanks. Great audience.
Thank you.